The first knock came less than 2 hours after I unloaded the last moving box. I was still in my boots, dust on my jeans, when I opened the front door of my new mountain cabin and found 3 people standing there like they were about to stage an intervention. The woman in front, arms crossed, wore a visor, chunky sunglasses, and a clipboard like it was a weapon. She didn't even wait for me to say hi. "You can't park your truck on that slope," she barked. I blinked. "Good afternoon to you too." "I'm Cheryl," she said like it should mean something. "President of the Ridgewood Pines HOA. That slope is common land. Your truck's on HOA property." "Is that right?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder. My Chevy was parked just off the gravel, tires barely edging the grass. Behind her, the other two, some guy with a Bluetooth headset and a woman already snapping a photo, nodded like backup dancers. Cheryl wasn't done. "Also, this cabin violates several Ridgewood Pines aesthetic codes. The roof color's not approved, your porch swings the wrong style, and there's no record of this structure being formally registered with the HOA. I laughed. "Lady, this cabin's been here for 30 years. Then it was built illegally," she snapped. "We're going to need you to hand over the land usage documents and remove the swing immediately. If you don't comply by Friday, we'll be issuing formal violations and fines." I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms. "You sure you want to do this?" Cheryl narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me, you're trespassing," I said calmly, "and you're trying to claim land that doesn't belong to you. You're going to look real stupid when this backfires." Her voice went up a pitch. "Is that a threat?" "No," I said, "it's a spoiler." She jabbed her pen at me. "You'll be hearing from us." Then Cheryl and her HOA hit squad marched off like they'd accomplished something. I watched them go, then shut the door and walked over to the kitchen table, where my lease packets were still sitting in a cardboard box. I pulled out the papers labeled Ridgewood Pines Holdings LLC. I smiled. Because my name, Jaron O'Connell, was right there on the paperwork. I didn't just buy the cabin. I bought the entire development, which meant Cheryl and her little HOA circus. They were squatting on my land. By the time the Ridgewood Pines Welcoming Committee disappeared down the dirt road, I'd already opened a folder labeled Historical Survey Maps Ridgewood County. The cabin came with a treasure trove of documentation going back 5 decades, blueprints, land parcels, even old correspondence between the original developers and the state zoning office. It had taken me 6 months of quiet research and legal wrangling to buy out the dissolving land trust that owned the undeveloped lots and common areas in Ridgewood Pines. Apparently, no one had told the HOA. The property lines had shifted after a defunct timber company sold off parcels during a bankruptcy in the 90s. Most of the board probably assumed the HOA controlled everything inside the neighborhood signs. But paperwork didn't lie, and neither did satellite overlays. I pulled up the GIS map on my laptop, overlaying survey data with the current satellite view. The slope Cheryl claimed as common land was clearly within the boundary of my parcel, and several so-called HOA-maintained trails cut across private landmine and a few others. I flagged those for later. The next morning, I drove into town. The Ridgewood County Recorder's office was tucked between a bakery and an antique shop, the kind of place where you could still smell ink on paper. I introduced myself to the clerk, an older man in a flannel shirt who raised his eyebrows when he saw my last name. "You related to that O'Connell who bought the Ridgewood parcels?" he asked. "That'd be me," I said, sliding over my ID and the transfer certificate. He let out a low whistle. "Well, you're gonna rattle some cages." "Already started," I said. "I just need certified copies of the parcel boundaries and the quitclaim deeds. Oh, and the zoning variance that was granted in '92 for the Upper Ridge." He gave me a knowing look. "They've been pretending that variance doesn't exist for years." I left with a manila envelope thick enough to serve as a doorstop. When I got back, there was a pale yellow note taped to my front door. It wasn't handwritten, it was printed in bold, blocky font. Mandatory compliance notice. It went on for 3 pages. listing violations ranging from unauthorized roofing material to nonconformity of architectural character. At the bottom, it demanded a fine of $400 and included instructions to remit payment to Ridgewood Pines HOA within 72 hours. I didn't even bother reading the rest. Instead, I walked around to the utility pole at the edge of my driveway and opened the weatherproof lockbox that housed the deed marker. I unscrewed the metal plate, revealing the etched parcel number just as expected. I took a photo, then I made 3 calls. One to the county assessor's office to request a site inspection. One to the Ridgewood Sheriff's Department to file a formal notice of harassment, since this marked the second unsolicited approach involving false land claims, and the last to a land use attorney I'd worked with during the purchase. Her name was Raquel Price, and she was the kind of lawyer who could make a grown man cry just by reciting code violations. "They're issuing fines for violations on land they don't own," she said when I explained, "Correct." "And trying to enforce aesthetic codes on a structure that predates the HOA charter." I heard her typing. "That's textbook overreach. I'll draft a cease and desist by this afternoon." While Raquel worked her magic, I installed a set of trail cameras along the tree line. Not just because I wanted footage, though I did, but because I had a hunch, and I was right. The next evening, just after dusk, I saw the flicker of headlights through the trees. 2 figures in hooded sweatshirts stepped out of a white SUV and made their way toward the shed behind my cabin. They didn't see the red infrared light blinking quietly from the motion-triggered camera. The next morning, I found my padlock broken and a spray of orange paint across the side of the shed. Not HOA compliant. I printed the camera photos and drove straight to the sheriff's office. Deputy Marla Torres took one look and shook her head. "That's felony vandalism plus trespassing. You pressing charges?" "I'd like to start by filing a report," I said, "but yes, I'll be pressing charges once we ID them." She leaned back in her chair. "Let me guess. Ridgewood Pines HOA, I've got reason to believe they're behind it. One of them had a hoodie with the HOA logo." Marla sighed. "That group's been pushing boundaries for years. Nobody ever stood up to them." "Well," I said, "that's about to change." I gave her copies of the deed, the parcel boundaries, and the time-stamped security footage. She promised to send a patrol up to take photos and check for prints. Back at the cabin, I found another note pinned to my fence. This one was shorter. "Unauthorized structure must be removed immediately. Final notice." Except this time it was signed. Cheryl Danvers, HOA President. I took a picture and added it to the growing file on my laptop labeled Evidence Ridgewood Pines HOA. Raquel called that afternoon. "I've got the cease and desist ready." Also, I pulled their incorporation documents. They filed as a nonprofit but never registered their enforcement authority with the state. That means they can't legally impose fines at all. I laughed. "You're saying they've been bluffing this whole time?" "Not just bluffing," she said. "Committing fraud. If they collected money under the pretense of legal enforcement powers, that's a serious offense. I'm drafting a complaint to the state attorney general's office." That evening, I climbed up the ridge trail with a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and a clipboard. I set up just above the HOA's community garden, which, according to my maps, sat squarely on land that had never been deeded to them. It was technically unclaimed, until I staked a claim. I planted a small wooden sign that read, "Private property trespassers will be prosecuted." Then I snapped a photo of the sign in front of the garden and attached a copy of the deed parcel to it. It was time to squeeze back. Raquel sent me the final draft of the cease and desist the next morning. I printed 5 copies and hand-delivered one to Cheryl's porch. She was watering petunias when I walked up. Her face went pale when she saw me. "You can't just—" I held up the envelope. "You've been served. This is a legal cease and desist. Effective immediately, you're to stop issuing fines, harassment notices, or any communications asserting authority you don't have." She snatched the envelope and tore it open. Her eyes darted over the first page and her mouth opened, then closed. I continued, voice calm. You've also been reported to the sheriff's office for vandalism and trespassing. I've got security footage. I suggest you advise your board to hire counsel. This is outrageous, she stammered. We've maintained order here for over 20 years. I stepped off her porch. You've maintained delusions. That ends now. As I walked back toward my cabin, I passed the Bluetooth guy from earlier. He was adjusting a decorative flag in his yard and tried to avoid eye contact. Morning, I said. He nodded stiffly. Heard you're stirring up trouble. I prefer the word truth. I kept walking. By the time I reached my front steps, 2 more neighbors had approached me quietly, privately. One was a retired park ranger. The other ran a local plumbing business. Both had questions. And both had stories about threats, fines, and intimidation from the board. I listened. And I took notes. Because this wasn't just about my cabin anymore. This was about the entire neighborhood. The following Monday, right after sunrise, a county-issued white SUV pulled up beside my cabin. Out stepped a man in tan slacks and a nylon windbreaker with the Ridgewood County seal stitched on the chest. He introduced himself as Inspector Delaney, the site assessor I'd requested. He carried a laser rangefinder, a worn leather notebook, and a no-nonsense expression that told me he didn't have time for nonsense. I've got your parcel maps, Mr. O'Connell, he said, unsnapping his clipboard. Let's confirm what's yours and what's not before somebody else tries to play sheriff. We walked the perimeter together while he took measurements and notes, his boots sinking slightly into the leaf mulch where the HOA had laid down gravel for their so-called nature trail. He paused when we reached the garden area and eyed the faded wooden benches and compost bins. This part's been in use, but I'm not seeing any registered easement or lease on file for it, he muttered. That's because there isn't one, I replied. They've been using it without permission, he frowned. Then it's technically encroachment, might be time to file a land use complaint. As we rounded the final edge of the property line, Delaney pointed to a small solar-powered streetlight mounted on a metal post. It had been drilled directly into a boulder near the trailhead. Do you see that often? I asked. He examined the base. Not unless someone bypasses the permitting process. This isn't county installed. I snapped a photo. So it's unauthorized electrical work on private land. Yup, he said, scribbling in his notebook. And pretty sloppy too, wiring's exposed. I handed him a portable drive with the parcel overlays and timestamps of the HOA's installations. He nodded, tucked it in his bag, and promised to file his report by the end of the week. By late afternoon, I'd compiled enough documentation to build a case sturdy enough to make a courthouse gavel pause mid-swing. Rackwell had already filed the formal cease and desist, but now we were stepping into real legal territory. That evening, I invited the 2 neighbors who'd approached me, Ranger Bill and Linda the plumber, over for coffee on the porch. Bill brought a folder of his own, thick with printed emails and photos. Linda carried a manila envelope marked certified mail. Bill leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. 2 years ago, they threatened to revoke my access pass to the fire road because I wouldn't let them dig a drainage ditch across my lot. Said it was shared responsibility. I told them to show me the title authority. Never heard back, just found the ditch dug anyway. No notice, Linda shook her head. They fined me for commercial vehicle parking because my van has a logo. I appealed and they said it was denied, but I never even got a hearing. They just kept adding late fees. Did you ever pay it? I asked, her expression hardened. No. I filed a complaint with the state licensing board, never heard back. I think Cheryl's got someone inside the department. Things just disappear. I tapped my pen against my notepad. You 2 willing to go on record? Bill gave a slow nod. You bet. I've been waiting for the right time, Linda added. If someone's finally holding them accountable, I'll talk. The next morning, I received an email from Rackwell. The State Attorney General's office had opened a preliminary investigation. Apparently, the complaint we'd submitted had teeth, because it included not just fictitious fines and forged authority, but unauthorized financial activity. Turns out, the HOA had been collecting dues into a private account registered under Cheryl's husband's name. Rackwell had traced the EIN number back to a landscaping company that hadn't done business in over a decade. That's when things got serious. Later that day, 2 unmarked sedans rolled into Ridgewood Pines. They parked just past the community sign, and 4 men and women in plain suits got out. One of them clipped a badge to his belt as they approached the HOA's Community Relations Office, a glorified shed next to the tennis court. I stood at a distance, watching through binoculars from the ridge. Within minutes, they'd entered the shed and shut the door behind them. 10 minutes after that, Cheryl was escorted out, handcuffed and red in the face. Her husband followed, looking dazed and mumbling something about a misunderstanding. By dusk, the entire board had either resigned or were under formal investigation. The county issued a temporary administrative hold on all HOA functions pending legal review. But I wasn't done. I called a private auditor I'd worked with during a previous property acquisition. His name was Marcus, and he had a reputation for finding discrepancies buried so deep it would take a backhoe and a week of sifting to uncover them. I sent him every financial document I'd collected so far, along with Rackwell's findings. Within 3 days, Marcus called with news. "They've been double booking maintenance charges," he said. "Charging residents for services that were never rendered, then claiming the same costs as expenses to a defunct LLC. That's wire fraud, Jaron. Can we prove it? I've already drafted a summary. This goes beyond state jurisdiction. You're looking at federal exposure." That night, I printed a copy of the summary, sealed it in an envelope, and dropped it off at the county prosecutor's office in town. I didn't need a big scene. The facts would speak for themselves. The next week, Ridgewood Pines was quieter than it had been in years. No patrols, no clipboard warriors, just neighbors tending their gardens, walking their dogs, and giving me nods that carried something heavier than thanks relief. On Thursday, I received a letter from the Ridgewood County Court. It confirmed the HOA's operating license was suspended pending outcome of the investigation. All fines were frozen, all accounts seized, Rackwell called that night. Her voice sounded lighter than usual. "You just dismantled a fraudulent HOA in under 3 weeks, she said. "That might be a record." "I had help," I said, "and a lot of patience," she laughed. "Well, you've also made the news. The local paper's running a story tomorrow, headlines about a landlord who turned the tables." I glanced out the window, toward the ridge trail where the old garden still sat abandoned. The wooden sign I'd posted was still standing. But now, beside it, someone had added a small bouquet of flowers in a mason jar and a note that simply read, "About time." I didn't know who left it, didn't need to. What mattered was clear. Ridgewood Pines was no longer under siege, and even better, it was finally mine to protect. The sun had just dipped behind the ridgeline when I parked next to the old logging road north of Ridgewood Pines. I'd received a call from Marcus earlier that afternoon. He'd followed a paper trail from a shell landscaping company to a second account buried under a different name one never disclosed to residents. Its registration address. A P.O. box in another county. I'd asked him to send me everything. What arrived wasn't a spreadsheet, it was a bombshell. Hidden in the transactions were a series of payments labeled as fire mitigation contracts, with dates stretching back 5 years. The amounts were suspiciously round, $5,000 here, $6,000 there, paid quarterly. The problem: Ridgewood Pines had been flagged by the Forestry Service for failing to meet minimum firebreak standards 3 summers in a row. I drove out to where the HOA claimed to have installed a firebreak. What I found was a tangle of dry brush and rusted tools left to rot in the undergrowth, no cleared trail, no access road, not even a fire ring. I took photos from every angle, geotagged them, then drove straight to the Ridgewood County Emergency Management Office. Inside, a woman in a navy blazer and hiking boots named Carly took one look at the pictures and frowned. "That's supposed to be cleared every spring," she said. "We've sent warnings before. They told us they hired a contractor." "They did," I replied, setting down the folder. "Only the contractor doesn't exist, and neither does the work." She flipped through the pages, her expression darkening. "If they claimed mitigation was done, and we have reports stating otherwise, that's falsifying documentation tied to public safety. Which means I need to call the fire marshal and the state's Department of Natural Resources." This just became criminal. I left the office with a sinking feeling that quickly turned to resolve. Fraud was one thing, endangering lives to line your pockets. That was another level entirely. By the next morning, Ridgewood Pines was crawling with inspectors. State vehicles lined the main road, and uniformed officials walked the trails with clipboards and GPS devices. A fire marshal in a Navy windbreaker shook his head at the so-called mitigation zone near Lot 19. "This place is a matchstick waiting for a breeze," he muttered. Meanwhile, the community buzzed with questions. Residents gathered in small groups, watching from porches and driveways, whispering in tones that turned sharper with each passing hour. That afternoon, I received a call from a man who introduced himself as Special Agent Keating with the State Attorney General's office. He wanted to meet. We sat on my porch, each with a thick folder in front of us. He reviewed my notes, Rackwell's filings, Marcus's audit, and now the fire marshal's early findings. "What you have here," Keating said, "is a conspiracy to defraud, misuse of public safety funds, and possibly environmental endangerment. If that firebreak had failed during a red flag warning, everyone in this valley would have been trapped." I nodded. "They gambled with fire season to cover their own theft. We're convening a grand jury," he said. "We'll need your testimony." "I'll be there." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur. Subpoenas were issued. Cheryl and 2 former board members were arrested again, this time without the dignity of polite interviews. Their homes were searched. Files were seized. The P.O. box Marcus discovered was found to contain dozens of returned checks, all marked undeliverable, all traced back to HOA dues. The local news picked up the story now with a headline that pulled no punches. "HOA fraud scandal exposes firebreak lie endangers dozens." I tried to stay out of the spotlight. My job wasn't to gloat, it was to make sure the neighborhood got justice and a future. One evening, as I was patching up the old shed where the spray paint had never quite come out, a knock came from the gate. It was Bill, the retired ranger, carrying a clipboard and wearing his old Forestry Service hat. "We had a meeting," he said. "A bunch of us. We want to start fresh. No more fake fines, no more threats, no more pretending a garden bench violates some secret code. Just a community board, volunteers only, no dues unless voted on by everyone." I dusted my hands off. "And you want my blessing, we want your help keeping it honest. You own the land. We figure if we're going to do this right, we should do it with the guy who stood up to them." I looked past him at the hills, where the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the forest floor, then back at Bill. "You get me bylaws that protect every resident equally, no loopholes, no president nonsense, and you've got yourself a landlord who'll back you." He grinned. "Already working on it." Over the next month, Ridgewood Pines changed in ways no one had predicted. The signs came down. The so-called compliance office was converted into a free tool library. The fake garden, once a monument to HOA vanity, was transformed into a real one, this time planted and maintained by actual residents. Without the constant pressure of fake violations and board politics, people started talking again. Firewood was shared, fences were mended. A neighbor named Doreen organized a weekend trail cleanup, and for the first time, no one asked for permission or charged a convenience fee to use the brush chipper. At the grand jury hearing, I testified second after the fire marshal. I laid out the timeline, the documents, the threats, the fake fines, and the trail of fraud that led from a clipboard-wielding tyrant to a felony investigation. The jury handed down indictments on 6 counts: wire fraud, falsifying public safety records, misuse of HOA funds, conspiracy to commit fraud, criminal trespass, and negligent endangerment. Cheryl pled guilty to 3 of them to avoid trial. She'll be banned from holding any leadership position in a registered organization for life. Her husband, who handled the fake contracts, is facing state prison time. The HOA as it once existed was formally dissolved by court order. Its accounts were liquidated, and all illegally collected funds were returned to residents plus interest, thanks to a civil suit Rackwell filed. I didn't take a dime. Instead, I asked the court to transfer the remaining funds into a community improvement trust, managed by residents, not me. The trust was used to finally clear the firebreak, properly, with permits, with county oversight, and with a crew made up of volunteers and some of the very neighbors who once feared losing their homes over mailbox paint colors. One afternoon, as I stood near the ridge trail watching the last of the clearing work wrap up, a young couple walked by with their toddler. They just moved into one of the cabins previously owned by a board member now serving probation. "Is this the trail that used to be off limits?" the man asked. "Was," I said. "Now it's open and safe." He looked around. "Heard a lot of weird stories about this place." I smiled. "They're not stories. They're warnings." As the sun dipped low and the trees cast long shadows across the trail, I locked the gate behind me for the night. A new sign hung on it now, not one that threatened fines or enforced silence. It simply read, "Welcome to Ridgewood Pines. Respect the land. Respect your neighbors. Nobody's above the rules." And for the first time in a long time, that was true.